Back in the medieval world, strange and unsettling things were just part of everyday life. What would terrify or disturb us now seemed completely ordinary to them. So let's take a look at some of the eerie customs and bizarre practices that people once accepted without question. When solid proof was impossible to find, medieval people often turned to a justice system that could only be described as terrifying. It was called trial by ordeal. The idea behind it was simple. If you were innocent, divine power would protect you from pain. If you were guilty, then you were on your own. The most common form of this test was the hot iron ordeal. The accused had to carry a burning iron bar for 9 feet. Their hands were then wrapped in cloth and inspected 3 days later. If the burns were healing cleanly, that was proof of innocence. It meant that God had intervened. If the wounds became infected, guilt was confirmed. In other words, during medieval times, having strong health could make you look like a criminal. Another ordeal involved water. The accused were bound and thrown into a pond or river. If they floated, it meant guilt, because the pure water rejected their sinful body. If they sank, they were considered innocent. It was the ultimate lose-lose situation. Good news, you are innocent. Bad news, we may not pull you out in time. In the hot water ordeal, the accused had to reach into boiling water to grab a stone. A record from the year 1133 mentions a man whose arm was burned down to the bone. He was still declared guilty because the wound festered, said to be a reflection of his soul's corruption. The most dramatic version was trial by combat, where you literally fought your accuser until one of you could no longer continue. It was believed that God would grant strength to the side of the innocent. A record describes 2 old farmers battling over a small plot of land, both so weak that the fight dragged on until sunset, when the judges finally called it a draw. These wild practices were taken very seriously until the Fourth Lateran Council in 1215 forbade priests from taking part, which gradually brought the ordeal system to an end. For centuries, a person's innocence was judged not by logic or testimony, but by how their wounds healed or how they behaved in water. Justice was not blind. It was just absurd. While these ordeals tested individuals, there were also moments when entire towns were swept into madness. Imagine your entire community suddenly dancing without control. Not for an hour or two, but for days or even weeks. People danced until their feet bled, some collapsing and dying from exhaustion, yet no one could stop. This strange and terrifying event became known as the Dancing Plague. The most famous outbreak struck the city of Strasbourg in the summer of 1518. It began with a woman named Frau Trophea, who started dancing alone in the street. Within a few days, more than 30 others joined her. Within a month, around 400 people were caught up in the madness, moving endlessly day and night. These were not happy celebrations. No one was cheering or asking for more. Many cried out for help, screaming in pain as their bodies refused to obey them. City records describe people dancing non-stop, collapsing from exhaustion only to rise again. Some suffered strokes and heart attacks from the strain. The death toll reached dozens before the outbreak finally faded. The city authorities tried to solve the crisis with the worst possible advice. They believed the dancers needed to keep moving to release the sickness. So they provided musicians and built dance halls to encourage more movement. It was like trying to cure someone's illness with more poison. What began as one woman's strange dance turned into a haunting mystery that still puzzles historians today. Authorities even built raised stages and brought in professional musicians to play for the exhausted dancers, convinced that if they kept moving, the madness would burn itself out. But Strasbourg's strange outbreak was far from unique. Dozens of similar dance epidemics swept through Europe over the centuries. In 1374, for example, the Rhine River region saw thousands of people fall into the same uncontrollable frenzy. A monk from the Abbey of Cologne wrote that crowds jumped and spun through the streets, screaming wildly until they dropped to the ground from sheer exhaustion. What could have possibly caused these disturbing episodes? One of the most logical explanations is ergot poisoning. Ergot is a fungus that grows on rye and contains chemicals similar to LSD. During rainy years, such as 1518, it spread rapidly through grain stores. Bread made from contaminated rye could easily have triggered intense hallucinations. Imagine biting into your morning loaf and suddenly seeing visions. That was not your average breakfast. Other historians believe it was a case of collective psychological breakdown, now called mass psychogenic illness. In 16th century Strasbourg, famine, disease, and poverty created unbearable stress. People may have released that tension through uncontrollable movement. Whatever the true cause, the dancing plagues remain among the strangest recorded mass events in human history. The final major episode occurred in the mid-1600s, and after that, they vanished without explanation. Today, neurologists study these outbreaks as rare examples of how the mind and body can react together under intense pressure. Those unfortunate dancers were not the only ones appearing in public spaces during medieval times, though. Other performers had fur, feathers, or hooves. That is because medieval justice often put animals on trial, complete with lawyers, witnesses, and full courtroom rituals. These proceedings were not treated as jokes. They were carried out with full seriousness, sometimes dragging on for weeks. Pigs were the most frequent defendants since they wandered freely through towns and occasionally injured people. Court archives from the 14th to 16th centuries list more than 80 such trials, with accusations ranging from property damage to fatal attacks on children. One nursery rhyme might have said this little piggy went to market, but in medieval Europe, this little piggy might have gone straight to court. The legal process was surprisingly detailed. In 1386, a case in Falaise, France, involved a pig accused of killing a child. Records show that the animal was dressed in human clothing and brought before a judge. It was assigned a lawyer who argued that the creature had no understanding of right or wrong and, therefore, could not be held accountable under human law. The trial continued regardless, ending with a formal verdict and public execution, witnessed by townsfolk as if it were any other legal event. Medieval justice, it seemed, did not discriminate between man and beast when it came to assigning guilt. That was basically the medieval version of saying, "My client is a ham, not a criminal." The church's deep involvement made these strange trials even more surreal. Religious leaders genuinely believed animals had moral awareness and could consciously commit sins. This idea was widely accepted, which led to animals being formally excommunicated or even anathematized, meaning they were cursed by the church. Some cases reached ridiculous extremes. In 1474 Switzerland, a rooster was prosecuted for the unnatural act of laying an egg. The judges declared this a clear sign of demonic influence, since roosters could not lay eggs. The unfortunate bird was burned at the stake alongside its supposed infernal egg. That is taking free range to an entirely new level free range all the way to execution. The case of the beetles of St. Julian shows just how elaborate these proceedings could become. When swarms of beetles devoured the vineyards, officials issued a written summons nailed to the vines, commanding the insects to appear in court. When, unsurprisingly, no beetles attended, the court appointed a lawyer to defend them. The attorney argued that the beetles were part of God's creation and were only fulfilling their natural purpose by eating plants. Therefore, they could not justly be punished for doing what they were made to do. Not every animal trial ended in tragedy. In one 16th century French case, a female donkey accused of an immoral act was acquitted after villagers testified to her good reputation. The court records described her as a most virtuous and well-behaved creature, known for her clean habits and upright character. The bizarre custom extended far beyond farm animals. Even rats found themselves summoned before judges. In one well-documented 16th century case from Autun, France, a group of rats was charged with destroying local barley stores. When they failed to appear, their appointed defense lawyer cleverly argued that they could not safely travel to court because of the danger posed by cats along the route. The court granted an extension, proving that even rodents could win a procedural victory. These animal trials eventually disappeared during the 18th century, as Enlightenment thinking brought more rational approaches to law and science. For centuries, however, they reflected how differently medieval society viewed the moral connection between humans, animals, sin, and justice. While animals were having their day in court, humans were gathering in very different public spaces that mixed cleanliness with contamination. Contrary to modern stereotypes, medieval people did bathe. They simply did it in ways that would make today's health officials faint. Communal bathhouses were common throughout Europe, but they were far from the serene spa experiences we imagine. Picture huge wooden tubs filled with warm water where men, women, and children all bathed together, often completely naked. It was less a spa and more a public hot tub party where everyone showed up uninvited. Rules from 15th century Germany reveal that bathhouses often reused the same water for multiple sessions, with only a bucket or two of hot water added to freshen it up. A Nuremberg city law from 1467 required bath owners to change the water at least once every 2 weeks, suggesting that fortnight-old bath water was perfectly acceptable. Medical writers warned about bad air rising from the shared water, but most people ignored these cautions. With so many bodies soaking together, bathhouses became ideal environments for spreading disease. They were, quite literally, giant human soup pots. Still, bathhouses were an important part of community life. People gossiped, made business deals, and celebrated major events there. Records from several cities mention bath parties held after weddings or during guild festivals. A German account even describes 48 leather workers drinking beer and soaking together for hours. Many bathhouses also operated as discreet brothels, with attendants providing more than just scrubbing services. Come for the bath, stay for the company could have been their motto, though cleanliness was debatable. City councils across Europe struggled to control this practice. A French ordinance from 1410 required bathhouses to hang either a white or red flag, white meaning bathing only, red signaling that extra services were available. According to historical documents, most bathhouses proudly displayed red flags. The result was predictable: frequent outbreaks of disease and infections that spread rapidly through entire towns. Medical writings from the era describe a number of illnesses that spread quickly through bathhouse patrons. A physician's record from 1485 even blamed outbreaks of painful rashes in private areas on infected bath attendants. Despite the danger, bathhouses stayed fashionable well into the 1500s, until the rapid spread of syphilis across Europe finally convinced people to rethink the idea of communal soaking. When public bathhouses fell out of favor, Europeans started to adopt what could be called the dry cleaning approach to hygiene. Instead of washing with water, they relied on perfumes, scented oils, and frequent linen changes. Ironically, this shift helped create the myth of the filthy medieval peasant, when in fact, many people did bathe, just in ways that were often less sanitary than avoiding baths entirely. While bathhouses were sites of social mingling and questionable cleanliness, medieval public squares were home to a far darker form of entertainment. Justice in the Middle Ages was not only severe, but also deeply theatrical. It was designed to humiliate, terrify, and make moral examples out of the condemned. This was especially evident in the punishment of bestiality, a crime that turned into some of the strangest spectacles ever witnessed. When someone faced such an accusation, the animal involved was also deemed guilty and spiritually polluted. The result was one of the most bizarre customs in legal history. Both the human and the animal were placed on trial together, and if convicted, executed side by side. Medieval law took fairness to an extreme level, ensuring that every accomplice received justice, even if one of them was a farm animal acting on instinct. Court archives contain many recorded cases. One detailed report from 1546 in Falaise, France, describes a man convicted of having relations with a sow. The court ordered both to die, and city financial records confirm payments made for building a special gallows strong enough to hang both man and animal together. As if that were not strange enough, the condemned animals were often dressed in human clothes before their execution. The same Falaise document lists expenses for the sow's outfit, including pants, a jacket, and a pair of white gloves. Yes, they literally dressed a pig for her own hanging. A 1474 Swiss court file mentions a cow found guilty of similar acts. Before her execution, she was clothed in a smock with ribbons in her hair, described as looking like a young bride. The bill for her outfit nearly matched the payment made to the executioner himself. Why dress animals like people before killing them? Religious scholars argued that it symbolized the animal's corruption by human sin. A theological essay from 1435 explained that clothing the creature as human acknowledged that it had absorbed humanity's moral stain through its unholy interaction. The ceremony, in their view, was meant to recognize divine justice being served on both man and beast. These executions were massive public events that drew crowds from miles around. Town squares would fill early with eager spectators, and vendors sold food and ale to the gathering throngs. The entire scene resembled a grim festival or carnival, complete with laughter, gossip, and morbid fascination. It was like a medieval version of a public fair, except the main attraction was an execution instead of a performance. Children were often brought to witness the spectacle as a moral lesson. A magistrate's diary from 1483 tells of taking his 8-year-old son to watch a bestiality hanging, noting with satisfaction that the boy appeared suitably horrified and would surely never forget the punishment for such wickedness. The executions themselves varied depending on the region, but all shared one thing in common. They were vicious, slow, and unforgettable displays meant to burn the lesson into everyone's memory. Hanging was one of the most frequent punishments for both the person and the animal. Sometimes both would be suspended from the same gallows, with the creature going first and the person following after. In other instances, both were burned together at the stake. After the execution, the bodies of both human and animal were usually reduced to ashes as a symbolic act of cleansing for the town. Those ashes were either scattered into a nearby river or buried in ground that had never been blessed, often mixed with salt to ensure nothing would ever grow there again. As disturbing as these executions of humans and beasts were, they were not the only examples of how medieval justice handled the dead in peculiar ways. Some legal customs shifted focus away from the living entirely. In most ages, once a person dies, the law loses interest. Yet in the medieval world, death did not always mean freedom from prosecution. In one of the most bizarre traditions ever practiced, corpses were occasionally exhumed and placed on trial in elaborate proceedings known as posthumous trials. These eerie displays of legal formality were not mere legends, but official and recorded cases. Judicial records across Europe reveal many incidents in which the deceased were dug up, carried to court, and formally judged for crimes committed during life. It was justice at its most literal, being tried by a jury of the living while you were very much dead. The most famous of these events was the trial of Pope Formosus in the year 897, often called the Cadaver Synod. The newly enthroned Pope Stephen VI harbored a deep hatred toward his predecessor, so he ordered that Formosus' 9-month-old corpse be exhumed, dressed in sacred robes, and placed upright on a throne in the papal courtroom. Historical accounts describe how Pope Stephen ranted furiously at the decaying corpse for hours, while a frightened deacon hid behind the throne, responding in a high-pitched imitation of Formosus' voice. It was a grim parody of a trial, and the outcome was as gruesome as the spectacle itself. The dead pope was declared guilty of perjury and unlawfully taking the papal office. His 3 fingers used for blessings were sliced off. Every decree he had issued was annulled. His robes were ripped away, and his remains were thrown into the Tiber River. Chronicles later claim the body washed ashore and was said to perform miracles, sparking public outrage that led to Stephen's downfall and eventual murder. Posthumous trials, however, were not reserved for popes and princes alone. Ordinary men and women accused of witchcraft, heresy, or serious theft could also face the same grim fate after death. Court officials, priests, and physicians would gather at the burial site, often at night, to avoid attracting crowds. The body, no matter how long buried, would be unearthed and presented for judgment. A French record from 1447 gives a haunting description of a dug-up corpse, its skin turned green and black, the flesh still clinging to parts of the face and hands, emitting a stench so vile that witnesses became physically sick. A defense representative was then appointed for the deceased, usually a reluctant priest or lawyer forced to argue on behalf of the rotting accused. Many protested these duties, such as one French attorney in 1485, who unsuccessfully begged to be excused from representing the remains of the condemned heretic Marcel. If the deceased was found guilty, the body faced new punishments. It could be hanged once again, despite already being dead. Some were burned, hacked apart, or subjected to grotesque symbolic executions intended to finish the justice that life had failed to deliver. Seizing property was a frequent outcome, which helps explain why so many posthumous trials occurred. They provided authorities with a convenient legal method to confiscate the wealth of the recently deceased. A financial record from 1462 reveals that after a wealthy merchant was found guilty of heresy in a posthumous court, the town's yearly income rose by almost 15% due to the takeover of his estate. In a sense, medieval governments invented the concept of ghost taxes, forcing even the dead to contribute to public revenue. The smell, however, must have been dreadful. Legal documents occasionally mentioned special measures taken to deal with the stench. Courtrooms would open their windows wide, perfume-soaked cloths were handed out to attendees, and in extreme cases, the trials had to be held outside to spare everyone's noses. By the 16th century, these bizarre proceedings started to fade as legal institutions became more structured and rational, though surprisingly, they still appeared now and then until the 18th century. The last well-documented case occurred in 1761 when French officials exhumed a corpse and placed it on trial for blasphemy. While such trials may seem absurd today, they reflect how differently people of that era viewed life, death, and divine justice. Speaking of remains, medieval Europeans had many inventive ways to reuse the dead once legal matters were complete. In the modern world of ready-made furniture and online decor stores, it is difficult to imagine filling one's home with genuine human bones. Yet for people of the Middle Ages, bones were not simply buried and forgotten. They served as artistic material, religious symbols, and even collectible curiosities. After wars, outbreaks of plague, or when burial grounds grew overcrowded, the remains of the dead were often exhumed and used for decoration rather than reinterred. This created a haunting architectural style that would shock any modern designer. Perhaps the most famous example is the Sedlec ossuary in what is now the Czech Republic, often referred to as the Bone Church. After the devastation of the Black Death and the Hussite Wars, the small chapel was adorned with the bones of somewhere between 40,000 and 70,000 individuals. That is recycling taken to a truly macabre level. The builders transformed mortality into art, crafting a chandelier said to contain every type of human bone, ceilings draped with skull garlands, and noble family emblems fashioned entirely from skeletal remains. A traveler's account from 1511 records a sense of awe and silence upon witnessing such an extraordinary display made from the victims of plague. This fascination with the dead was not confined to Bohemia. Throughout Europe, charnel houses showcased bones in intricate designs that merged reverence with decoration. A French bishop's report from 1443 describes an ossuary where skulls were arranged in floral and cross patterns, and long bones radiated outward like beams of light, producing a scene both sacred and unsettling. For those with a more personal interest in the macabre, owning a piece of the dead became something of a trend. Collecting bones from execution sites or battlefields became surprisingly popular, functioning as a gruesome version of the souvenir trade. It was like visiting a historical landmark and taking home a reminder, only far more disturbing. Official records from 1468 detail the arrest of a man caught selling the finger bones of executed criminals as good luck charms. The judge's notes revealed his disgust that more than 30 such bones had already been sold before the man was detained. Battlefields, too, became fertile hunting grounds for such morbid collectors. Chroniclers recount that after great clashes, local peasants would wander among the fallen, filling sacks with remains. One French account from the aftermath of the Battle of Agincourt in 1415 describes villagers gathering teeth and finger bones from the English dead, believing them to hold magical power. This grisly trade grew so widespread that it eventually spawned an entire counterfeit relic market that flourished for decades. A court document from 1482 tells the story of a merchant who had been caught selling fragments he claimed were pieces of the skull of St. Martin. Upon closer inspection, they turned out to be pig bones that had been carefully bleached and aged to resemble ancient relics. It was the original counterfeit relic industry, the medieval version of "Trust me, this is St. Peter's toe bone," not leftovers from dinner. Over time, grave robbing changed from a rare crime into a recognized underground profession. Cemetery logs from several European towns record the growing problem of bone theft and the measures taken to stop it. One London parish book from 1521 lists regular wages paid to a night guard whose job was to protect the resting dead from those who would steal their bones. The market for human remains expanded so greatly that by the 16th century, many cities felt compelled to create strict laws to control it. A legal decree issued in Venice in 1531 warned that anyone discovered removing bones from graves for profit, curiosity, or supposed magical purposes would face harsh penalties. Such regulations show how serious the problem had become. Over the next 2 centuries, the trade slowly faded as social and religious perspectives on death evolved. By the 18th and 19th centuries, greater respect for burial sites and stricter cemetery rules brought an end to the once lucrative bone market. Still, remnants of this era remain visible in the great ossuaries of Europe, where human bones were transformed into art instead of being sold or stolen. These haunting displays, like the great bone churches of the Czech lands in southern Germany, now attract tourists from around the world. They stand as eerie memorials to a time when death was seen not as something to fear or conceal, but as an ever-present companion woven into everyday life, inspiring both reverence and creativity.